By the time the coach set Tamsin Colton down at the edge of Selby, she had counted her money twice and disliked the sum both times. $9. A satchel of clothes on a leather strap across her body. Her mother's comb and the family name scratched small into the clasp. That was the whole of what the world had left her at 20. Her mother had been 3 weeks in the ground. The fever took her in a single hard week, and it took the house with her, because the house had never truly been theirs. There was a note on it, held by a man in town who wore a black coat to the burying and came to the door before the flowers had wilted. "You understand my position," he told Tamsin on the porch. "The debt outlived your mother. The property answers for it now. This is my home," she said. "It is collateral," he said, not cruelly, which somehow made it worse. "My wife will need the linens by Sunday. There is a coach on Thursday if you have somewhere to be." She did not have somewhere to be. She had a satchel and a comb and a name and a stubbornness she had not yet met, because the world had not yet made her stubborn. So she rode west. She rode until the coin ran thin and the green ran out and the country turned to a hard, pale, cracked color, and she stepped down where the road quit, because roads that quit are cheap to reach. Selby sat in a shallow bowl of ground, the shade of old bone. There were no reeds along the street, no frogs at dusk, no green smell of water anywhere in the wind. A town that size should have owned a river. This one owned only a wide scar of dust that curved through the low ground where a river had plainly once run. She asked the coach driver about it while he handed down her satchel. "River?" He laughed once, without humor. "Nearest running water is 90 miles east, miss. Been that way longer than I've driven this road. Selby's a town that lost its river and never got over it." He climbed back to his seat. "You picked a dry place to be broke in." She tucked a loose coil of auburn hair back into its braid and started up the street. The wind carried grit, not damp, and her cream dress, printed small with faded flowers, went gray at the hem inside 100 steps. She meant to find a bed for $1 and a plan for the morning. She found neither that evening. What she found first was the thing at the low end of town, and she stopped dead in the road to look at it, because a person simply could not walk past it. It was a ferry. A great flat wooden ferry, marooned in a wide bend of cracked earth, tilted a few degrees off level, going nowhere and going there permanently. Its deck stood higher than a loaded wagon. A tall timber A-frame rose off the stern like a gallows, strung with heavy chain and a rust-seized pulley the size of a dinner plate. And here was the strangeness that pinned her boots to the ground. The deck was still loaded. A whole freight wagon sat lashed to the planks, wheels and all, its canvas long gone to gray rags on the ribs. Barrels ringed it, chained upright. Crates were stacked and roped as though the load were still bound for some market, and the market had merely forgotten to open. No one unloads a boat and abandons the cargo. No one leaves a wagon standing on a deck for the sun to bleach through 40 summers. Yet here it all stood, in a channel with no water for 90 miles, freighted to the rails, and sealed under decades of dust. Tamsin walked closer until she could read the stencil on the nearest barrel. Black paint faded to the color of a bruise. She read it, and her breath went out of her all at once, and she had to put a hand on the cracked bank to keep her feet. The stencil read Colton Crossing. She did not sleep in a bed that night. She sat on a bench outside a shuttered mercantile and watched the stranded hull go from gold to blue to black against the stars, and she turned the name over until it stopped being a coincidence and became a question. Colton was her name. It was scratched into her mother's comb. It was burned into the clasp of the only thing she owned, and here it was again, painted onto a wreck in a dead river, waiting for her at the end of a road she had chosen almost by accident. She did not know it yet, sitting on that hard bench, with the stars coming out over the marooned hull. But the loaded ferry in the dry bend had been waiting a long time for a Colton to come back and pry it open. Morning brought the auction, though she had not planned on it. The county was selling what it called abandoned property to square unpaid assessments, and a clerk had tacked the notice to the mercantile door in the night. 3 lots. A dead man's tools. A wagon with no team to pull it. And, at the very bottom of the bill in smaller print, the stranded ferry in the old bend. Sold as scrap and salvage, whole load included, no warranty of soundness, no access to water expressed or implied. A dozen men gathered in the dust of the yard to watch, more for the sport than the goods. None of them bid on the ferry. They laughed at the very notion of it. One of them, a broad man in a fine gray coat, said loudly that a boat in a desert was a fool's monument, and the county ought to burn it before it wasted ink selling it. The men around him laughed the loud, easy laugh of people agreeing with someone who signs their pay. The clerk asked for a bid on the ferry anyway. He asked once. He asked twice. The silence in the yard had teeth in it, and Tamsin felt the whole town lean into that silence, sure it would stay empty. $4, she said. The yard turned as one to look at her. The clerk squinted as though she had spoken in a foreign tongue. $4, he repeated slowly, from the young lady with the satchel. You'll want a bed more than a wreck, miss, said the broad man in the gray coat, and his voice was almost gentle, which was worse than mockery. That deck has held nothing but sun since before you were born. There's no water within 90 miles to float it, and there never will be again. Buy supper instead. $4, she said again, and set the coins on the plank table one at a time, so the ring of each one carried across the yard. $9 had already become 5 in a single day of not eating and paying for grain the driver had charged her for. Now she let 5 become 1. The clerk looked around once more for a wiser offer, found only grinning faces, and brought his flat hand down on the plank. Sold, he said, to the girl, for $4. God keep her. A few men laughed again. The one who had mocked her boat did not. He watched her over the heads of the others with a still, measuring look. The look of a card player who has just misread a hand and is counting backward to find his error. Tamsin did not know yet that she should be afraid of that look. She would learn. She had spent nearly the last of her money on a ruin the whole county found funny. She had $1 left and no roof but a tilted deck, and she walked down to the bend and climbed up onto the ferry because it was hers, and because a thing that is truly yours is not nothing, even when everyone alive agrees that it is worthless. Up close, the ferry was larger than it had looked from the road. The deck planks were a foot wide and gray as ash, pinned with iron bolts as thick as her thumb. She walked the full length of it and made an inventory, out loud, because counting a thing is the first way of coming to own it. 11 barrels. 9 crates. 1 tall freight wagon. Coils of chain gone the color of dried blood. A capstan seized solid with rust, and that great timber A-frame at the stern, and the plate-sized pulley, and a cable as thick as her wrist that ran off the bow, dove into the cracked earth of the old bank, and did not come up again on the other side. She knelt at the bow and dug at the buried cable with her fingers until they bled, and it did not give at all. It was anchored to something under the bank, something enormous and patient, something that had not moved in 40 years and did not intend to move for her. She sat back on her heels and studied the whole rig, and slowly a picture came together in her head. A ferry like this was not a boat that a man rowed. It was a boat that hung. She would learn all of it later from an old book and an older woman. but she guessed the shape of it that first afternoon. The heavy cable had once run bank to bank across a living river, high above the water. The ferry had hung from it on that pulley, tethered but free to swing. And then, somehow, the ferryman had used the river's own current to shove the boat across without oar or steam, angling the hull against the flow so the water pushed it from one shore to the other and back. It was a machine that ran on a river as a mill runs on a stream. Take the river away, and the whole clever thing became a wagon that could not roll, and a hull that could not float. The freight wagon in the center of the deck was locked, not merely closed, not simply roped shut, but locked, with an iron hasp and a padlock rusted into one solid red mass. She wrapped both hands around the lock and pulled until her shoulders ached, and it did not so much as rattle. She could not open it that first day, nor the second. She would earn her way into it slowly, which is how it goes with the things that are worth having. For now she spread her shawl in the wagon's long shadow and slept there on the tilted planks, in a country with no river, under a sky crowded with cold stars, and not once did she think of the Thursday coach. Selby, by daylight, was a company town wearing a county's clothes. She saw it as she walked the streets the next morning, looking for work and water. The mercantile, the land office, the freight yard, the new brick bank, even the livery, all wore the same small brass plate beside the door. Meridian Land A&D Water. She read the plate 4 times before she understood that one hand held the whole town in its fingers, and that the broad-shouldered stranger in the gray coat, the one who had called her boat a fool's monument, was that hand. His name was Harlan Voss, and Meridian was his, and Selby was Meridian's. She learned it plainly from an old woman named Bess Ardley, who kept a dozen hens in a wired yard behind the smithy, and remembered when those hens had drunk from a river instead of a hauled trough. Bess looked hard at Tamsin's face when they met over the fence, and then she looked harder, and her hand crept up to her own mouth. "You have the Colton chin," the old woman breathed. "Lord above. You have Ezra's chin, exactly his. Come back to me across 40 years. Ezra Colton was my grandfather," Tamsin said carefully. "I never knew him. He died before I was born. I only have his name." Bess sat down slowly on an upturned pail, as if the years had reached up all at once and taken her knees out from under her. "Then you had best hear the truth from someone who was standing here when it happened," she said, "before Harlan Voss feeds you the version he sells to strangers. Sit down, girl, sit, and I will tell you about the night the river jumped." Tamsin sat on the ground with her back to the fence, and the old woman told her about the river, and the telling changed everything. 40 years back, Bess said, the Quillen had run full and brown and loud straight through the very bend where the ferry now lay dying in the dust. Ezra Colton had built the crossing there with his own hands and his own money. He had strung the great cable from bank to bank, rigged the ferry to ride it, and carried every wagon, every peddler, every bride and coffin and trail-worn cattle herd over the Quillen for a fair toll. He held a charter from the territory itself for the sole right to keep that crossing, and he held a land patent for the whole broad tract along the near bank, a patent whose one moving edge was the Quillen itself, for the river was the boundary line between the Colton ground and the neighbor grant across the water. Colton's Crossing, they had called the place, and the town of Selby had grown up around his tolls like green moss around a spring. Then came the spring it jumped, Bess said, and her voice dropped. "You will not have seen a river jump. Pray to God you never do." It had rained 6 weeks straight in the high country that year, she said. The Quillen came down swollen and mean and the color of coffee, carrying whole trees. It rose against its banks and worried at them all through one black night. And above the crossing, where the ground was low and soft and the river leaned hard into a tight bend, it finally tore straight through its own bank and cut a shorter, steeper road toward lower ground. It did not creep. It did not rise and fall and shift a little as rivers do over years. It leapt. In the dark, in a matter of hours, the Cuillin cut itself a whole new channel and went roaring away across the flats, and it abandoned the old bend, and the town, and the ferry with a full load still chained to its deck. By the time the sun was fully up, Bess told her the river was simply gone, off east across the country as though it had somewhere better to be. The old loop stood full for one season, a long dead pond going green at its edges. Then the pond sank to mud, and the mud cracked and paled to the bone she was looking at now. And there sat her grandfather's ferry, high and hard aground, freighted to the rails, in a bend with no water left in it. He was on it, Tamsin said. It was not a question. She had known it the moment she touched the buried cable. He was on the deck when the water pulled out from under him in the dark, Bess said. He had a wagon aboard and the cable in his 2 hands, and he rowed that ferry down into the falling water and the mud in the space of one dark night, hollering for a river that had already torn itself a new road a few miles east. When the sun came up, he was sitting in a sea of drying muck, and Ezra Colton owned a boat that would never float again, and a crossing with nothing left to cross. The old woman's eyes were wet, but her voice stayed steady. It broke him. He went straight to the land office to save his ground. But while he was ruined and grieving, a tax sale appeared in the county book against the Colton tract for a debt he had never owed. On taxes, his own receipts showed paid to the day. There had been no delinquency and no true sale at all. Only a fresh deed to Meridian stamped down on top of his patent, and no clerk would lift the new paper to read the old one beneath. He died inside the year. The family scattered to the winds. Your mother was a baby in arms when they carried her out of this valley, and there was no one left to answer for the name. And the river? Tamsin asked. Where did it go? The driver said 90 miles east. 90 miles east, child, and it never once looked back. Bess nodded toward the marooned hull down at the bend. The jump itself only carried it a few miles that first night. But a river that has once left its bed turns restless. It cut a new loop, and then another, and the dry years and the ditches men dug upstream took the rest, until the nearest live water to Selby lay 90 miles off. She leaned closer. Now here is the part you must hold on to. Voss and his Meridian people tell it that the Cuillin wandered off its old line slow and lawful over the years, and that the Colton ground crossed to their side of the water a little at a time as it went. That is a lie, and I stood on my own porch and watched God's truth with these eyes. It did not wander. It jumped. In one single night, the way a horse clears a fence, but there is no one left alive to swear it but me, and I am one old woman, and Harlan Voss owns the fresh paper and the counter and the ear of every judge that rides through. Tamsin looked at the stranded ferry for a long, quiet moment. Why does it matter how the river left? She asked at last, if the plain fact is that it left. The old woman smiled a thin, hard smile that had waited 40 years to be smiled. Because the law cares, she said. The law cares more about that one question than about anything else in the world. Now, go and get into that locked wagon, girl, before Harlan Voss remembers there is anything on that deck worth locking. It should be said plainly here that Tamsin Colton had no schooling in law and no natural love of it. What she had was a stranded boat, an old woman's story, $1, and a stubbornness she was meeting for the first time in her life, now that the world had stripped away everything else that might have softened it. So if you have ever been handed nothing at all, and then been told to be grateful for it, subscribe and ride this crossing to its very end. Because the wreck in the bend was about to make the whole Laughing County choke on its own amusement. The trouble came for her on the 4th day. and it wore Harlan Voss's good gray coat. He rode out to the bend on a fine tall horse with two hard-faced men behind him, and he sat easy in the saddle looking up at her on the deck of her own ferry as though she were a strange bird that had landed somewhere it had no business being. "You wasted $4, Miss Colton," he called up to her. "I will give you 6 to be rid of it, and count it charity. Sign the salvage over to Meridian, take the profit, and there is a coach going south on Thursday. A young woman should not be sleeping rough on a wreck." "You know my name," she said, not moving from the rail. Voss smiled up at her, unbothered. "I know every name in this valley, Miss Colton. It is my business to know them. And I will be honest, yours interested me more than most the moment I heard it." He let that sit a beat. "Your grandfather owed this county money he never paid before he died. That ground you are standing on, and this whole town site behind me, came to Meridian fair and legal when his patent lapsed for want of an heir to work it. The boat is yours. You were fool enough to buy it in front of witnesses, and I will not take it back. But the ground it rots on is mine. So is the water it used to ride, and the new crossing east where the Quillen runs today. Be sensible. Take the 6. And if I am not sensible, then you are a squatter camped on Meridian ground," he said, still pleasantly, "and squatters can be moved along, one way or another. I would rather it be the gentle way." He touched the brim of his hat to her, courtly as a churchgoer. "Thursday's coach, Miss Colton. I truly would take it." She did not take it. She watched him rein the horse around and ride back up to his town, his 2 men falling in behind him, and when the dust of them had settled, she turned and went straight to the locked freight wagon and its one red mass of rust. This time, when her hands began to hurt, she did not stop. She had decided something while Harlan Voss smiled up at her, though she could not yet have said what. She only knew she would learn this deck to save herself, because the wreck was the one thing standing between her and the coach south, and she did not intend to be moved along one way or another by any man in a fine coat. She could not break the lock by force, so she started with the barrels, which were only chained upright and not locked. The first held salt gone to a single white stone. The second held nails welded into rusted bricks. The third held bolts of trade cloth rotted to brown lace that fell apart in her fingers. She worked down the row through a long, hot afternoon, cataloging a dead man's freight, learning the shape of what her grandfather had been carrying on the night the water ran off and left him. The 9th barrel was different. She knew it the moment she pried the head off, because it had not been packed by a freighter at all. It had been packed by a careful, frightened man in a hurry. Inside, wrapped again and again in oilcloth against the very flood that would strand it, lay a surveyor's kit, a long brass measuring chain folded in links, a battered compass in a wooden case, a plumb bob, and a thick bound book of field notes, its pages close written in a sloping, urgent hand. On the flyleaf, in ink gone brown, it read, in the hand of Ezra Colton, sworn surveyor, being the true survey of the crossing of the Quillen. She could not sleep that night for reading it by the light of a stub of candle. Her grandfather, it turned out, had walked and measured the river long before he ever built a plank across it. He had walked the whole bend on foot, driven stakes into both banks, sighted his compass along every line, and drawn the Quillen's course in careful ink, loop by loop, bearing by bearing. Here was the old channel, rendered exactly where the dry, cracked scar now curved through the low ground. Here were the 2 banks of his crossing. Here were the stone corners of his patented section, each one tied by chain and compass to a mark he had set in the earth with his own hand. Tamsin did not understand every page of it, but she understood one thing well enough to make her sit bolt upright in the dark with the candle guttering. The field notes did not describe a river that wandered slowly year by year. They described a river fixed and settled in its bend for as long as her grandfather had measured it. And then, on the very last dated page, the careful hand broke into a wild scrawl. The river has torn through its bank above the crossing in the night and taken a new course to the east. It is gone. God help us all. The quillen had leapt. It had not crept an inch. At first light she carried the heavy book to Bess by the henyard and set it open on the old woman's knees. "You told me the law cares how a river leaves a place," she said. "You have to tell me why. Tell me the whole of it. I have my grandfather's own hand saying it jumped, but I don't know what that is worth." Bess ran her thumb over the shaking last line, and she was quiet for a long while. "There was a lawyer came through here once, years back," she said at last. "Riding a land case, 2 counties fighting over a river that had moved between them. He explained the whole thing to me over a plate of my eggs, and I never once forgot it, because it seemed to me that the entire ruin of your grandfather sat inside it." She looked up. "Listen close, because there are 2 words, and everything turns on which one is true." There were 2 words, Bess told her, and everything hung on which one was true. The first was accretion. When a river that marks a boundary moves slow, grain by grain, a little each season, wearing one bank and building the other, the line moves right along with the water. The man the river leaves loses that ground lawfully, and the man across the water who gains it keeps it lawfully. That was the common course of rivers, and it was the whole of Harlan Voss's story. He said the quillen had crept off its old line little by little over the years, and that the Colton ground had passed across to the neighbor tract he had bought, foot by foot, as it went. If that were so, the old woman admitted, her grandfather's line had crept away to nothing, and Voss owned every foot of Selby free and clear. "And the other word?" Tamsin asked. "The other way? The other word is avulsion." Bess said it slowly, and the strange word filled the small kitchen like a struck bell. Avulsion was when a river did not creep at all, when it left its old bed all at once, in a flood, in a night, and cut itself a brand new channel somewhere else. And the law said of it the exact opposite of what it said of accretion. When a river leaped, the line it had marked did not leap with it. That line stayed behind in the abandoned bed, right where it had lain the evening before, and the ground on either side did not change hands, merely because the water had bolted off in a hurry. If the quillen had wandered away slow, the old woman said, the Colton line had gone with it, and the girl had nothing but a wreck. But if it had leapt, then the line had never once stirred, and the ground from the old channel outward was Colton ground to this hour, wet or bone-dry, and every last lot Voss had sold in the new streets stood on land that had never been his to sell. Tamsin sat very still on the kitchen floor. "And my grandfather's own field notes," she said, "and the plat he filed under seal with the territory, say in his own hand that the river leapt in the dark." "They do," Bess said, "which is exactly why that book is not a dead man's keepsake. It is a deed to half this town, if a court can be made to read it." She closed the cover gently over the shaking last line, "and it is exactly why Harlan Voss will burn it, and burn you along with it, the instant he learns you are holding it. So you will breathe not one word, and you will go and get the rest of it out of that locked wagon, because I promise you a man like your grandfather did not put his charter and his patent anywhere the flood could reach them. He put them where you are sleeping. The rest was in the wagon, exactly as the old woman said." Tamsin knew it now with a certainty that had no argument in it. She went back to the tall freight wagon on the deck with the surveyor's cold steel chisel from the 9th barrel, and this time she did not fight the rusted hasp so much as court it. She wet it from her one canteen. She tapped it, pried at it a little, let it rest, wet it again, and pried once more. It took the better part of 2 days. She did not force the lock. She persuaded it, and on the second evening, with the low sun throwing the whole marooned hull's shadow long and red across the cracked bend, the hasp gave all at once with a sound like a held breath finally let go, and the wagon opened itself to her. It was not gold. She had half feared it would be, and half hoped, and it was neither. Inside the tall-sided wagon, packed as carefully as the surveyor's kit had been, stood a small iron strongbox, a fat roll of oilcloth, and a bundle of letters tied in a faded ribbon that had once been blue. She lifted the strongbox out first and worked its simpler lock, and inside were papers. Only papers. She almost laughed aloud at the dry desert joke of it. And then she began to read them, and she stopped wanting gold at all. Forever, the first sheet was the charter. By grant of the territory to Ezra Colton and to his heirs after him, the sole and exclusive right to keep and work a ferry at the crossing of the Quillen River, with all tolls arising, in perpetuity, so long as the crossing itself be maintained. The second sheet was the patent, the land office deed itself, signed and sealed with the Great Seal, granting to Ezra Colton and his heirs forever the whole tract along the near bank, its far edge described by course and distance down to the Quillen itself, the water the boundary, and the meander line only the survey's record of it. Not a lease. Not a squatter's claim to be proved up. A patent, the strongest paper the government could issue on land, the kind that did not die because a man died, and did not lapse because a river changed its mind. Folded in with it was a thin sheaf of county tax receipts, each one stamped paid through the very year the river left, and every year her grandfather drew breath after. Proof, in the county's own ink, that no tax had ever gone owing on Colton ground. The third thing, unrolled from the fat oilcloth, was the plat, the finished survey map, drawn to a fine scale, every corner fixed to a stone monument, the river itself inked in loop by loop as the tract's one boundary, and the meander line only its faithful record of that water. The whole crossing rendered in her grandfather's own hand, and then filed, stamped and certified as true under the territorial surveyor's seal. It showed the old channel of the Quillen, lying precisely where the dry bend curved today. And it showed the Colton ground reaching back from that channel, across the very land where Harlan Voss had since laid out the new streets of Selby, the brick bank, the busy freight yard, and his own fine white house on the hill. Tamsin Colton sat down on the deck of her stranded ferry, with the whole proof of a stolen town spread across her lap, and she understood at last, fully and finally, why a locked wagon in a dead river had been worth a rich man's careful lie. The letters, when at last she untied the blue ribbon, were the smallest papers there, and the heaviest to hold. Folded in among them was a leaf torn from a family Bible, the Colton births and deaths set down in the same sloping hand, her own mother's name written there as Ezra's daughter. The plain thread that tied the young woman on the deck to the man who had signed the patent. They were from Ezra to that daughter, and the last of them had never been sent. They kept me at that counter, he had written in a failing hand, until my good patent was buried under their fresh ink, and no man would look at mine. Keep the papers. Keep the crossing if you can. And if you cannot keep the crossing, keep the truth of it. The river jumped. Whatever else they take from you, remember always that it jumped. She did not sleep at all. She sat up through the whole cold night with the charter and the patent and the plat and the last unsent letter, and she thought about a good man ruined at a wooden counter by a single clever lie, and about the well-dressed man who owned that counter now, and she made her choice before the sun came up over the flats. She would not take Thursday's coach. Not that Thursday, nor any other. She would carry the papers into the land office in broad daylight, in front of the whole town. and she would make them read aloud the truth her grandfather had died holding on to. Harlan Voss heard she was coming before her boots ever reached the office step. He was already inside when she pushed open the door, leaning easy against the long counter. And the land agent, a dry stick of a man named Hale, would not lift his eyes to meet hers. "Miss Colton wishes to file some sort of claim," Voss said smoothly, before she could get a word out. "On land already patented and paid for by Meridian. Mr. Hale, be so good as to show her the register, so she can see the matter is closed." "There is a patent already recorded in this office," Hale said, tapping a fat leather book with one gray finger. "Meridian holds this entire section, filed clean and current. Whatever paper you have brought in, girl, it is 40 years too late, and a dead man's beside." Tamsin laid her grandfather's patent flat on the counter beside their register, unrolled and plain. "This one is older," she said quietly, "by 40 years, and it never lapsed. A land patent does not lapse because the man who earned it dies. Mr. Hale, you know that far better than I do. You have known it the whole time." Hale's dry face went a shade grayer, and his gray finger stopped tapping. Voss did not move at all, but something behind his eyes shifted and sharpened. "The river was the line of that old patent," he said evenly. "And the river moved. Accretion, Miss Colton. The law could not be clearer on the point. When a boundary river shifts its course, the boundary shifts with it, and the ground it leaves falls to the tract it joined. The Quillen crept off Colton land year by year, and every foot of it came lawfully to Meridian as it did. Your grandfather's line crept east into open desert. You are more than welcome to go and stand on it, if you can find where it ended up." "The river did not creep anywhere," Tamsin said. "It jumped, in one single night, and left its old bed lying right here in the sun. That is not accretion, Missy, Voss, that is avulsion. And when a river avulses, the law says the boundary does not follow it. The line stays in the old channel. The ground does not change hands at all, which means the Colton line still runs where that dry bend runs, and everything back of it is Colton ground yet, including the dirt your brick bank is standing on this minute." The word avulsion dropped into that dusty office like a stone through a glass window. Hale's head came up. He looked at Voss, and for the first time his careful, servile face held a real and open fear. Voss's easy manner did not crack, not all at once, but it thinned, and underneath it Tamsin saw the cold, hard thing that had been driving him all along. "You cannot possibly prove how a river moved 40 years ago," Voss said, and his voice had gone quiet and flat. "No one on earth can prove such a thing. There is not a living soul who saw it happen." "There is one," Tamsin said. "And there is this." She laid the plat down beside the field notes, open on the counter, turned to the last dated page, to the wild broken hand, the date beneath it. "My grandfather surveyed and staked this crossing before he laid a single plank across it, and filed his plat under the territory's own seal. Fixed to stone monuments a man can still dig up in that bend today. It draws the boundary of his land along the old channel, precisely where the dry bend lies. And in his field book, on the very night it happened, he wrote that the river tore through its bank and leapt away in the dark. Your own register recorded that plat, Mr. Hale, and never once recorded a lawful cancellation of it. You have been selling Colton ground for 40 years, Mr. Voss, by teaching this valley to call a jump a wander. I mean to stand in front of a judge and let him decide which of those two words is true." Voss straightened up off the counter, slowly, and the last of the pleasant mask came away. What stood beneath it was colder, and, in a strange way, more honest than anything he had shown her before. "You are a penniless girl with a dead man's papers, and no money to file them, let alone to fight a company through a court," he said. "I have moved squatters off far better claims than this one. Take the coach, Miss Colton. It is the last time I will say it to you in a kind voice. I am not a squatter. she said. I am standing on my own ground. And so, Mr. Voss, are you. She rolled the papers up under her arm and walked out, and behind her, lo, she heard Hale say, Harlan, if that plat is genuine, if it was ever stamped by the territory, then we are all of us. And she heard Voss cut him off short and hard. And she never caught the rest of it, because she was already crossing the wide dusty street to the county courthouse to ask, in a clear and carrying voice, exactly how a landowner went about filing to quiet her title against Meridian land and water. The weeks that followed were the hardest she had yet lived, harder than the burying, harder than the long dry ride west. Voss did not offer the coach again. He offered worse and quieter. Her $1 of standing credit at the mercantile vanished overnight, struck from the book by an unseen hand. The livery would no longer sell her a bucket of water at any price. A man she did not know stopped her in the street to mention, with a smile, how very dry old timber gets after 40 years in the sun, and how quickly a thing like that would burn. And one morning she found a note pinned to the A-frame of her Ferry in the gray dawn light. Unsigned, printed in block letters. It said only that boats burn faster than they ever floated. Bess found her an hour later, dry-eyed and shaking, stacking wet sacking and dampened canvas around the wagon and the strongbox, and the precious papers, as though she could smother a fire that had not yet been lit. The old woman took one long look at the girl and the note, and then she turned around and walked home without a word, and came back within the hour carrying her late husband's long shotgun and a box of shells, and she climbed up onto the deck and sat herself down on an overturned crate facing the town. Let him send his men out here in the dark, Bess said, breaking the gun open to check the loads and snapping it shut again. I have been wanting a good reason to feel young for about 30 years now. They came on the third night, as both women had known they would. 2 riders first, then a third, walking their horses slow along the dead bend with a single lantern hooded low against the dark. Tamsin lay flat on the cold planks behind a barrel and made herself small and silent. Bess sat upright on her crate, with the long gun across both knees, and let the riders come close enough that the creak of their saddle leather carried up to the deck. That is close enough, said Bess into the black, and she thumbed both hammers back, and the 2 hard clicks crossed the cracked ground louder than any shout could have. There is a can of coal oil at my feet, and a box of shells in my apron, and I have helped bury better men than the 3 of you in this valley. Ask yourselves whether a rich man's night wages are worth whatever comes next. The lantern stopped moving. For a long stretch there was nothing but the wind and the uneasy shifting of nervous horses. Then, without one word passing among them, the 3 riders reined around and went back toward the lights of the town, and their hoofbeats faded and were gone. Bess let the hammers down soft and blew out a slow breath into the dark. He will not try fire again now, she said. Fire only serves a man on a thing that nobody is watching. There are too many eyes turned toward this old boat these days. And she was right. Whatever Harlan Voss had wagered on all these years, it had leaned from the very start on darkness and on the certainty that no one would care, and the girl on the wreck had spent 4 of her last $5 buying, without ever meaning to, a whole valley of people who had quietly begun to. They were not, in the end, left entirely alone to be brave. The county had a district judge who rode a long circuit through the territory, and the turning of the circuit brought him around to Selby that very month to hear the quiet title suit, and the whole town crowded into the small plank courthouse to watch the penniless girl with the wrecked boat stand up in open court against the man who owned the county they all lived in. Voss had brought a lawyer down from the capital, a smooth man in a good black coat, with a voice like poured oil. Tamsin had a roll of oilcloth, an old woman and the plain truth, and nothing else at all. The capital lawyer spoke first. And he spoke very well. He called the Colton patent a quaint relic of the territory's rough beginnings. He held up Meridian's own filings, crisp and recent and orderly, and he laid his whole weight on time. 40 years, Your Honor, he said. For 40 years, Meridian and the families who bought from it have held this ground in the open, paid its taxes, and built their lives upon it, while no Colton ever raised a voice. Whatever this old patent once was, the law does not unwind 40 years of honest possession for a girl who stepped off a coach last month. He spread his hands to the packed room, and the river moved besides. Land follows water. It is the oldest and plainest rule in the whole book. This unfortunate young woman is chasing ground the Quillen carried off before she was born. Then the judge called on Tamsin Colton, and her hands shook at her sides, and she stood up out of her chair anyway and faced the room. "I am not a lawyer," she began, and her voice was not steady, and she made herself go on regardless. "I bought a boat in a desert for $4, and every man in this room laughed at me for it. And I expect a good many of you are still laughing now. But I have read my grandfather's own hand, page by page, and I am going to tell this court exactly what he wrote in it." She laid the heavy field notebook open before the judge with great care. He surveyed the Quillen River before he ever built one plank of a crossing over it. He drew its channel running through this very bend, where there is now nothing but dust and cracked mud you can walk across dry shod. And on the night the river left this valley, he wrote in this book that it broke through its own bank above the crossing and took a new course to the east in a single night. Not slowly, not grain by grain over the years, in one night. She turned from the judge to face the crowded room, and she found she was no longer shaking. "The gentleman from the capital told you that land follows water, and he is right as far as he went. When a boundary river moves slowly, wearing one bank and building the other, the line moves with it. The law calls that accretion, and by that rule this ground would be Meridian's, and I would take the coach south and trouble none of you again. But there is a second rule, every bit as old as the first, and he did not see fit to name it." She let the silence stretch. When a river leaves its bed all at once, in a flood, in a night, the law calls it a vulsion. And under that rule the boundary does not move at all. It stays in the old bed. The line holds where it lay the night before. She looked directly at Harlan Voss, seated stiff and pale beside his oiled lawyer. "So it turns on one question. Did the Quillen wander, or did it jump? And as for his 40 years, no man ripens a title by sitting on ground he took through a tax sale that never happened. My grandfather owed no tax on this ground, and here are his receipts, stamped paid by this same county through the year the river left and beyond. There was no delinquency, no lawful sale, and no notice ever sent, though the county well knew the owner dead and his heir a scattered child. A tax deed raised on a debt that never existed is void from its inception, and in this territory no man may hold adversely, under any statute of limitation long or short, save under color of title, held in good faith. And there is no good faith in the man who makes the very delinquency he then buys at his own sale. He stamped a false tax and a fresh deed atop a patent he knew was paid and standing. A title got by a man's own fraud is no color of title at all, and so Meridian's clock, whichever one he counts, never once began to run. If the river wandered, this is Meridian's town. But if it jumped, then this is Colton ground, and half of Selby has been sold for 40 years out from under my family's name." The judge leaned forward over his high bench. "You are asking this court," he said slowly, "to make a finding about how a river moved 4 decades ago, before most of us in this room were born. Can any living person testify to what they actually saw?" "One living person can," said Tamsin. "Bess Ardley watched the whole of it from her own front porch, and she has lived in this bend for 70 years. Bess rose from her seat, small and straight as a fence rail, and crossed to the stand, and was sworn with one steady hand raised. I have lived beside this crossing 70 years, and I will tell this court plainly what these two eyes saw, she said. That river did not wander off anywhere. I went to my bed one night with the Quilon running loud beneath my window as it had every night of my life, and I woke in the gray morning to find it gone clean away to the east, and a loaded ferry sitting stranded in the mud, where deep water had been the evening before. It jumped in the night in a matter of hours, gone before dawn like a spooked horse over a fence. Ezra Colton rode that boat down into the mud as the water fell out from under it, and I watched with my own eyes as they told that broken man his patent was dead. And that was the first lie of the 40 years of lies that built this town. She lifted one steady, knotted finger and pointed it straight at the field notebook lying open on the bench. And that book there says exactly what I say. It says it in his own hand on the night it happened. It jumped. The capital lawyer rose to take her apart, smooth and unhurried. You were a young woman 40 years ago, Mrs. Ardley. It was one night, in the dark, a long time gone. Memory softens. You did not walk upstream in the flood and watch the bank break with your own eyes, did you? No, Bess said. I am old, not a liar. I did not see the bank give way. I saw what it left me by morning, which is a river gone and a boat sunk in mud, and a channel drained between supper and sunup. A creeping river does not empty a whole bend in a night, sir. A jumping one does. So you would have this court hang a man's title on one old woman's memory. I would not, Bess said. I brought a witness who cannot forget, because he is dead. He wrote it down the night he lost everything, and his plat sits in that register behind you under the territory's own seal. Set his hand beside my mouth and tell me they do not speak of the very same night. The lawyer swung about to Tamsin, sharper now, sensing thinner ground. A private field book proves nothing. Any grieving man may scrawl what comforts him. Where is the corroboration in the earth itself? In the earth itself, Tamsin answered, and she unrolled the sealed plat across the rail so the whole room could see the inked meander and the little crosses that marked the stones. My grandfather set his corners to stone monuments and wrote their bearings on this map. Send any two men you trust out to that bend with a compass and a chain. They will stand on his stones exactly where this plat says they lie, along the old channel, and nowhere near where the Quillen runs today. A line surveyed to stone does not drift 90 miles in a lifetime. Mr. Hale holds the recorded copy in his own register. He can lay it beside mine within the hour. Every head in the hot room turned to Hale. Mr. Hale, you keep this county's register, the judge said. Come and be sworn. The dry man crossed the floor, raised one gray hand, and swore, and the judge ordered him to send a clerk that hour for the plat filed the year of the flood, and for every tax record that touched the Colton tract. Hale looked at Voss, and at the girl, and up at the judge waiting over them all, and the thing he had swallowed for 20 years came up at last. The plat is recorded, he said hoarsely. Filed under seal, the year of the flood, and no order of cancellation behind it. There never was one. He swallowed hard. And Meridian's title came off a tax sale that should never have touched the book. There was no delinquency on the Colton tract. The taxes were paid, every year. I hold the county's own receipts in my vault, and I have kept them there, God forgive me, for 20 years. The capital lawyer sat down, because there was nothing left standing to argue. His whole case had leaned on the years and on the guess that no one could ever. The judge read his findings one at a time, and each one closed a door. He found the Colton patent genuine, senior in time, and never lawfully cancelled, the register itself bearing him out. He found Tamsin Colton the true and only surviving heir of Ezra Colton, proved by the family record and left unrebutted. He found, by the clear weight of the recorded plat and the eyewitness together, that the Quillen had changed its course by avulsion and not by accretion, leaving its bed in a single night. He found, therefore, that the boundary had never moved from the old channel where Ezra Colton had staked it to stone. And he found Meridian's tidal void at its root, sprung from a tax sale for which there had been no tax owed, no delinquency, and no notice given, a fraudulent sale that conveyed nothing at all. Being void from its inception, he found, and worked in known fraud by the very man who then bought it, it could give Meridian no honest color of title, and since in this territory no possession ripens into title, under any statute, long or short, save upon color of title held in good faith, no length of possession upon that fraudulent paper could ever cure it. The ground back of the old channel, including all the streets that Meridian had platted and sold as the new part of Selby, was Colton ground, and belonged in law and in plain fact to Tamsin Colton, presently of this county. The packed room did not cheer. It was too thunderstruck to make any sound at all. Harlan Voss stood up out of his chair very slowly, settled his good gray coat across his shoulders, and walked out through the crowd and into the wide street he no longer owned a foot of. And he did not touch his hat to a single soul on his way. What Tamsin Colton did next astonished the town far more than the verdict itself had. She did not turn the settlers off the land the court had just placed in her hands. She had been turned out of a home once herself, with nothing but a satchel and her mother's comb, and she discovered she had no stomach at all for doing the same thing to another living soul. She quieted the town's fear in a single notice, written in her own plain hand and tacked to the mercantile door where the auction bill had hung. Every family that had bought a lot from Meridian in good faith, it said, would have its home confirmed to it under a sound new deed from the true owner. For the price of $1 and no more, the debt for the stolen money would be collected from Harlan Voss, and not from the people he had fooled. What Voss had taken from her family by a lie, she secured to strangers by a choice, and it made her, inside a single season, the one thing that Voss had never once managed to become in 20 hard years of owning the place. It made her trusted. Meridian's grand claim came apart after that like a barn in a hard wind. Voss had sold, for 40 years, what had never in law been his, and now the buyers paid their honest money to the true owner instead, and the smooth lawyer went back up to the Capitol, and the small brass plates came down off the doors of Selby one by one. She kept the charter too, folded and safe, though there was no river left within 90 miles to run a ferry on, and no toll left in all the world to take. But the ferry itself she kept above everything else. She would not let a single man break it up for its seasoned lumber, though the lumber alone was worth more than the whole boat by every reckoning but her own. She had the long deck swept clean, and the old freight wagon mended and set upright, and she made her home there, high and dry in the bend, beneath the timber A-frame that had once hung an entire crossing on nothing but the strength of a running river. Children walked out from town to climb on the seized pulley and to beg Bess to tell again how a river once cleared a fence in the dark. And Tamsin would unroll her grandfather's plat across the mended wagon bed and trace the old channel for them with one finger, and teach them the two plain words that had handed her back her name and her family's ground. Accretion, she would tell them, is when the water takes its slow and patient time. Avulsion is when it leaps. In time, the old bend stopped being a place the town felt ashamed to look at. Tamsin had a deep well dug beside the landing, the first new water Selby had drawn in 40 years, and she let anyone haul from it free who could not yet pay her for a lot. Freighters bound out across the flats began once more to lay over at the crossing, not to ford a river that was no longer there, but to rest their teams in the long shade of the great hull and buy grain and trade news. So the ferry that had carried nothing at all for 4 decades went slowly back to honest work, in the only shape now left to it, as a landmark, a gathering place, and a stubborn wooden monument to one plain fact. The ground a family stands on cannot be quietly carried off in the night, while a single honest paper still survives to say whose it is. On clear evenings, she would climb up and sit on the bow above the buried cable and look east across the flats, toward the far country the Quillen had run off to, too distant by 90 miles to see. A faint green thread she could only picture somewhere out beyond the horizon. And she would think about how very nearly she had walked straight past her own name lying there in the road. She had come into Selby with $9 and watched them dwindle down to a single coin on a wreck the whole county found hilarious. She had walked away from it all with a patent, a crossing, a town that trusted her word, an old woman she loved like blood, and a home that could not float and had no earthly need to. The ferry never crossed water again, and it never had to. It had already carried her across something far wider than any river, from a turned-out orphan with a satchel to the woman who held the ground beneath a whole town, and it had done it without moving a single inch, on nothing but 40 years of dust and one shaking line in a dead man's book. So here is the question the girl on the $4 boat leaves in your lap tonight. If you had come into Selby with a light satchel and a handful of coins, and found your own family name stenciled on a wreck the whole county was laughing at, would you have spent your last dollar on a warm bed and taken the Thursday coach south in the morning? Or would you have climbed up onto that maroon deck, pried open the locked wagon, and dared a whole town to keep calling a jump a wander? Tell me in the comments which of those two women you believe you would have been. And if a stranded boat in a dry bend held on to you clear to the end, follow along and stay close, because the next name waiting out there in the dust is one you will not want to miss.